Throughout the Book of Heaven, servant of God Luisa Piccarreta repeatedly uses a rather mysterious expression, as I was in my usual state. She then goes on to describe an encounter with Jesus, a teaching he gave her, or some experience of the divine will. But what exactly was Luisa referring to when she said, my usual state? Well, that's the topic of today's Divine Will Reflection. If you've read much of the Book of Heaven, you've probably noticed how often Luisa begins an entry with those words, as I was in my usual state. I actually counted the times that she uses that exact phrase in her diary, and it appears 214 times. And there are many other occasions when she uses similar expressions such as I was swimming in the divine volition, or as I was going around in the divine will. These phrases are usually followed by something like, my always lovable Jesus came to me. And then Luisa records the conversation that followed, often in great detail. So what was happening to Luisa when she described herself as being in her usual state? Luisa's usual state was a recurring mystical condition that became a regular part of her spiritual life. During these experiences, Luisa would lose her normal awareness of the world around her and enter into a deep state of prayer and mystical union. Her body would become rigid, described in some accounts as being petrified or rigid as stone, to the point that those around her could not move her normally. The official biography of Luisa, which was published by the Vatican, describes these experiences as beginning when she was about 17 and becoming increasingly frequent. Eventually, they became a regular part of her life, and this is an important point. Luisa wasn't simply going to sleep. During these experiences, she would often be completely absorbed in prayer, contemplating the passion of Jesus, making her rounds in creation, redemption, and sanctification, or conversing with Jesus. And when the experience was over, she would return to ordinary consciousness. There was something else remarkable about this state. Luisa couldn't simply just bring herself out of it. A priest would come to her home, pray over her, and give her a blessing. The blessing would release her from the condition, and she would return to her normal state. That official biography that I mentioned records that when Father Cosma Loiodice was first called to Luisa, his priestly blessing immediately freed her from the condition. This continued whenever she needed it for a period of years, and this was not something that Luisa particularly enjoyed. In fact, it was a tremendous humiliation for her. Not only because she was very shy and a private person, but also because she didn't want to be a burden to other people, especially a priest. She even prayed repeatedly that Jesus would free her from having to depend upon a priest. And this brings us to an interesting question. Why would Jesus allow or even require this? Was the priest's blessing simply a practical way of bringing Luisa out of an unusual physical condition? Or was there a deeper purpose? One of the clearest answers comes in November of 1902. Here are the circumstances. Luisa had been told that her confessor had received an order from the ecclesiastical authority, a certain Monsignor, that the priest should no longer come to bring her out of her usual state. She said, Monsignor commanded in an absolute way that the priest was not supposed to come anymore to make me come out of my usual state, but that I should go out of it by myself. At first, Luisa was happy about this. She had been asking Jesus for 18 years not to have to be dependent on a priest. But when the time came for her to enter into union with Jesus in her usual state, something unexpected happened. Luisa could not enter the state as usual. She was distressed because she desperately wanted Jesus to come to her, and this caused her much suffering. The next day, Luisa asked Jesus, Lord, shall you not make me come around yourself if you make me fall? In other words, when I fall into this state, couldn't you just bring me out of it yourself? And Jesus answered, No, it is a decree of my will to use the work of the priest to make you come round from that state of sufferings. That statement is very important. Jesus doesn't merely say the priest can help Luisa. He says that it is a decree of his will to use the work of the priest to bring her out of that state. And then Jesus tells Luisa something else. My wisdom is incomprehensible and has many unusual ways for the salvation of souls. In other words, there was a purpose behind something that, from a human perspective, seemed unnecessary, even burdensome. The priest was part of God's plan. By the way, it was only a few weeks before her diocese sent a priest again to release her from her ecstatic state. But that few weeks caused Luisa much suffering. So let's take a closer look at how Jesus used this situation of Luisa's usual state and her need of priests. So we have the priests who daily come to give her a blessing to release her from her ecstasy. In the process, they would be exposed to her holy demeanor and learn about the divine will from their conversations with her. Later, her own archbishop paid Luisa a visit. He experienced for himself the holiness of Luisa and obtained a favorable view of her situation. The archbishop who succeeded him also visited Luisa and was convinced of her authenticity. He even petitioned Rome and was granted permission to allow a priest to say daily mass in Luisa's home. So we can see the wisdom of God's plan. By making it necessary to have only the blessing of a priest bring her out of her usual state, priests, archbishops, and even the Vatican became aware not only of Luisa's mystical charisms, but also the revelations of Jesus concerning the gift of the divine will. Jesus wasn't giving these revelations to Luisa merely for herself. He was preparing something for the church, and he wants priests to be his instruments in spreading the divine will. Jesus tells Luisa, since my will wants to establish its kingdom in the midst of peoples, through you I want to deposit this celestial doctrine in my ministers as my new apostles, so that first I may form with them the link of connection with my will, and they may transmit it into the midst of the peoples. So we can see a progression here. Luisa's usual state served several purposes. First, it was part of her mystical life. It was the setting in which she frequently experienced Jesus and received the teachings that would eventually fill the book of heaven. Second, it was part of her victimhood. Her physical and spiritual suffering was offered for souls, and according to Jesus' explanation, served as a restraint against divine justice. Third, it established an indispensable relationship with the priesthood. Jesus deliberately made her dependent upon a priest to come and release her from this state. Fourth, it placed the priest in the position of witness and guardian. The priest wasn't merely there to perform a mysterious ritual. He was being brought into contact with what Jesus was doing in Luisa. There's something else here that I think is easy to miss. Luisa didn't understand everything that was happening to her, but Jesus was asking her to trust his wisdom rather than her own understanding. This is one of the central lessons of living in the divine will. We tend to think, well, if I understood God's plan, then I could trust him. But Jesus teaches Luisa almost the opposite. Trust him even when you don't understand the plan. And perhaps that's the most important lesson for us. Living in the divine will doesn't require us to understand everything God is doing. It requires us to surrender our human will to him and to trust that his wisdom is greater than ours. Luisa wanted to understand. Jesus wanted her to trust. And that's a lesson that isn't limited to Luisa Piccarreta. It's a lesson for every one of us who's trying to live in the divine will. Well, I hope today's reflection has been a blessing to you. Until next time, may the kingdom of the divine will reign in your heart. Fiat.